Welcome, my name is Rupert Vernalls and my talk has the rather unusual title of Obliquity and the unexpected results of the triple bottom line. So the concept of the triple bottom line encourages businesses to focus on people and planet as well as focusing on profit. And in fact, in this talk, using some core frameworks and methodologies that are normally taught by the world's leading business schools on MBA courses, we'll look at why it is the case that having a focus on people and planet can actually make a business more profitable than a business that purely focuses on profit. So we'll look at what the evidence is for this, why did this happen, and how can we use this information to become more successful in our own businesses whilst also focusing on people and planet. So what are the guiding principles at work here? How can we learn from this? But a bit more about me before we get started. So as I mentioned, my name is Rupert Vernalls. I run a business called the MBA Academy. Been doing that for the last 14 years, delivering mini MBA courses in professional service firms, also to a variety of FTSE 100 companies at leadership level to the likes of AstraZeneca. We make our content freely available to charities. We also make our content freely available in over 30 prisons. So over 22,000 prisoners have access to our content, helping them to start their own businesses on release. I've worked as assistant for course planning with Harvard Business Online as a module advisor on the Bath MBA. I'm kept up to date with the most recent theories taught on MBA courses, and we'll be looking at some of that MBA content in this session. Before doing this, I used to work as a lawyer, most recently for Osborne Clarke in their Silicon Valley office in California. And it's actually my time in Silicon Valley that sparked my interest in this subject. So it's well known that many of the founders of the most successful Silicon Valley businesses, the likes of Apple, Google and Facebook, during the early years were not driven by financial goals. They were simply working on problems they were passionate about, and they had no real idea of how successful their businesses would ultimately become. And this is something that I had seen working alongside startup businesses. The founders were really passionate about working on certain problems, and there was that passion that made them successful. The flip side to that was when many of those businesses received investment and their investors asked them to focus more on the bottom line and making more profit, they often became less creative, less innovative, and therefore less profitable as a result. This subject really fascinated me when I moved back to the UK in 2006. I remortgaged, did an MBA, and really focused on this subject during my MBA, so my dissertation concentrated on why it is the case that businesses that focus on profit at the expense of everything else often become less profitable as a result. And I've been looking into this ever since. So in this talk, we'll look at what the evidence is for this, why did this happen, as I mentioned, and then how do we use this information? So what are the guiding principles at work here? How can we learn from this? So starting off, what is the evidence for this? I'm just going to change my settings so you can see the slides more clearly. So what's the evidence for this? Well, in no particular order, starting off with respected business writers Jim Collins and Jerry Porras, who studied 36 leading companies, so companies such as Disney, Ford, Marriott, Pfizer, American Express, Sony and so on, for their book Built to Last, which compared the fortunes of these various different businesses. And as a result of their studies, they said the following: contrary to business doctrine, we did not find that maximizing shareholder wealth or profit maximization as the dominant driving force or primary objective through the history of visionary companies. Also adding, visionary companies pursue a cluster of objectives of which making money is only one, and not necessarily the primary one. Yes, they seek profits, but they're equally guided by a core ideology, core values, and a sense of purpose beyond just making money. Yet paradoxically, the visionary companies make more money than the purely profit-driven companies. A similar view is taken by ex-McKinsey management consultants Tom Peters and Robert Waterman, who studied 43 leading companies for their famous book In Search of Excellence, and they concluded, ironically, the companies with the most precise financial targets had done less well financially. I'll just change my settings back. It's important to note that this book has since been criticised because several of these leading companies had fared less well since the publication of this book. But the argument put forward by several leading economists is the reason why these businesses had fared less well was because they had actually become more focused on profitability. This is an argument put forward by leading economist and Financial Times columnist John Kay, who specifies that there was a shift in the values of businesses such as Boeing and ICI towards a focus on maximising shareholder wealth above and beyond everything else that had ultimately led to their decline, also stating that focusing on shareholder wealth is often self-defeating. And as I mentioned, this is something that I had noticed when working in Silicon Valley. Many of the businesses that had received investment and were asked to become more focused on the bottom line and improving profitability became less creative, less innovative, and ultimately less profitable as a result. And we look at more of the evidence for this later on in this talk. But none of this should be a surprise to us. Business gurus have been saying this for years. They've been saying that business should never purely be about generating a profit. Profit is just a means to an end. This is how Charles Handy, the co-founder of London Business School, puts this point. The purpose of a business is not to make a profit full stop. It is to make a profit so the business could do something more or better. That something becomes the real justification for the business. Or as David Packard, the co-founder of Hewlett-Packard, put it, many assume wrongly that a company exists to make money. Profit is not the proper end and aim of management. It's what makes all of the proper ends and aims possible. And finally, a quote from Peter Drucker, who many consider to be the founder of modern management. He said this back in 1954, profit for a company is like oxygen for a person. If you don't have enough of it, you're out of the game. But if you think life is about breathing, you're really missing something. So it's quite clear then that profit is just a means to an end, not an end in itself. But why would it be the case that a business that purely focuses on profit actually becomes less profitable as a result? Well, to understand why, we need to look at some core MBA frameworks and methodologies. And in looking at this, we're going to quickly look at something called the modern theory of business strategy, then a concept called the Sigmoid Curve, and then something called Obliquity. So let's start off with a modern theory of business strategy. So whenever any business looks to develop any sort of strategy in order to be successful in the long term, it has to find the best way in which it can use its own internal resources in accordance to the opportunities that are presented to it by the external marketplace in which it operates. So very simply, the modern theory of business strategy states that strategy must be tailored in accordance with the nature of the internal resource of the business itself, and tailored in accordance with the opportunities that are presented to that business by the external marketplace in which it operates. So we're trying to achieve what is sometimes referred to as a strategic fit between the internal environment, which is the business itself, and the external environment, its market. We're simply trying to match what the business can do with what its marketplace actually wants. And it sounds like an incredibly obvious concept, but it's surprising how often, for example, investors will simply invest in what appears to be perhaps a very exciting, fast growth marketplace without really understanding the business itself that they are investing in and whether or not it's got the necessary resources to really succeed within this exciting, fast growth marketplace. Or similarly, they'll invest in a business which apparently has got a great set of resources, great people, money in the bank, great premises, great products, services, perhaps a huge amount of market share, but something then changes externally, a new technology, a changing customer need, a new type of competitor that blows the business out of the water. In fact, history is littered with examples of where this has happened, where I had a business that looks like it's got everything right internally, great products, perhaps a huge amount of market share, perhaps the dominant player within the market, but something then changes externally, as I mentioned, a new technology, changing customer need, a new type of competitor that really demolishes the business. Some of the more famous examples of this might be Blockbuster, the dominant player in many jurisdictions in the video hire marketplace, and of course people start streaming, Netflix and so on replacing that business, Apple, Samsung replacing dominant players such as Nokia and BlackBerry, people start using their phones to take photos, replacing the likes of Kodak, Spotify, iTunes replacing high street music stores such as HMV, people booking online, replacing travel agents, Amazon replacing bookstores and then replacing all sorts of well-known high street brands, Uber replacing taxi companies, and so on. In fact, if it's not careful, every business will follow a particular trajectory known as the Sigmoid Curve. So the Sigmoid Curve is used to map a number of phenomena within the business environment. Often used to show a product life cycle with an introductory phase and a new product's introduced into the market, a fast growth phase as more people start to adopt this product or service, a maturity phase, the market starts to become more saturated, and then a phase of decline. And if you have a science background, you'll know that the Sigmoid Curve applies to just about anything in science and nature and the universe as a whole. But within the business environment, businesses need to, if they can at least, start to make the appropriate changes close to point A on the Sigmoid Curve, rather than when they're staring disaster in the face at point B. And the best quote that helps us sum up what the sigmoid curve is all about, and about point A and point B, comes from Charles Handy, the co-founder of London Business School. And this is what he says about the sigmoid curve. I'm actually going to switch my settings back quickly just to show you this quote clearly. The world keeps changing is one of the paradoxes of success, that the things that got you where you are seldom the things that keep you there. The sigmoid curve sums up the story of life itself. We start slowly, experimentally and falteringly. We wax, then we wane. It is the story of a product's life cycle and of many corporations' rise and fall. It even describes the course of love and relationships. If that were all, it would be a depressing image. The secret of constant growth is to start a new curve before the first one peters out. The place to start that new curve is point A, where there is the time as well as the resources and the energy. That would seem obvious were it not for the fact that at point A, all the messages coming through to the individual or institution are that everything is going fine, that it would be folly to change when everything is going so well. Or we nerve change, bit personal change or change in organisations tells us that the real energy for change only comes when looking disaster in the face at point B on the first curve. So what he's saying is we need to respond close to point A on the sigmoid curve rather than when we're staring disaster in the face at point B. But to be able to respond early, it means we can't just be chasing after the money, because if we're doing that, it means we're waiting for the world to say, well, now it's time to change, improve or invent something new. And if we're waiting for all of that data to come in, it's probably going to be too late. So a business needs to have an inner urge for progress, which is more than just chasing after the money. And as we'll see, where that inner urge for progress is a focus on people and planet, provided it follows certain guiding principles, it can challenge the business to rise to new levels of competitive performance. So we'll see, bizarrely, taking an indirect approach to profitability by focusing on people and planet can be more fruitful than a direct approach towards profitability. In fact, it's often the case when faced with any sort of complexity and uncertainty that taking what appears to be the most obvious and direct path is not always the best approach. And this is referred to as obliquity, and is best explained by the economist John Kay in his book of the same name. And there are lots of great examples of this. Let's have a look at three very quick examples in relation to obliquity before we apply this in a business context. So first of all, the Panama Canal. So when explorers were searching for the shortest route from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west, they assumed the shortest route would go from east to west. However, the people who found the shortest route were actually searching for gold, and what they discovered was the shortest route from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific actually went in a west to east direction. Forest fires, most forest fires are small and they burn themselves out, and with that they take out the combustible undergrowth, which creates natural fire breaks for future fires. So what they've discovered is the best way of preventing future fires is to not put all of the small fires out. The pursuit of happiness is also oblique. People who pursue happiness directly are often the most unhappy. However, people who challenge themselves to run marathons, climb mountains, and do all sorts of things that appear to be unpleasant are often the happiest. So it's often the case, particularly when we're faced with any sort of complexity or uncertainty, the best route is not necessarily the most direct or obvious one. And this is also true in relation to business trying to generate profitability. There's a great quote in relation to this that comes from a book called Breaking the Code of Change. And this says then, so organizations are non-linear dynamic systems in which there are many unintended consequences when direct linear action is taken. By setting economic goals at the top, management may actually prevent the company from discovering the factors that may be critical to its economic health. So we can start to appreciate then why it is the case that businesses that focus more on profitability become less profitable as a result. So finally then, how can we use this information? Is it a case we just focus on people and planet in the hope that in some way it will generate more profitability, or are there certain guiding principles at work here? Well, as we'll see, there are indeed guiding principles. So first of all, in relation to planet. So how can a business challenge itself by focusing on planet in a way that also generates more profitability? Well, one of the best ways in which a business can do this is to search out tough environmental legislation globally, even if that environmental legislation doesn't apply to them locally. This can force the business to upgrade products and processes, And when that law then spreads internationally, the business will have an important head start. There's a great quote in relation to this that comes from Professor Michael Porter from Harvard Business School. And this is what he says about this in his book, The Competitive Advantage of Nations. So I'll just change my settings quickly. So, tough regulatory standards are not a hindrance, but an opportunity to move early to upgrade products and processes. Some regions will typically lead others in terms of their concern with social problems such as safety, environmental quality, and the like. Instead of avoiding such areas as some companies do, they should be sought out. An advantage will result as other regions and ultimately other nations modify regulations to follow suit. Firms like governments are often prone to see the short-term costs of dealing with tough standards and not their long-term benefits in terms of innovation. Firms point to foreign rivals without such standards having a cost advantage. Such thinking is based on an incomplete view of how competitive advantage is created and sustained. So business should be challenging themselves ahead of the curve, and one way in which they can do this is by searching out the toughest environmental legislation across the globe and working hard to comply with that tough environmental legislation, even if it doesn't apply to them locally, because that can force the business to upgrade products and processes and give the business an important head start as that legislation then spreads internationally, as it often does. It's important to note that environmental improvements often go hand in hand with enhancing efficiency and reducing waste. I think this is best put by Michael Porter. So this is what he says about this point. So like defects, pollution often reveals flaws in the product design or production process. And therefore business should always learn how to frame environmental improvements in terms of enhancing efficiency and reducing waste. So let's have a look at some great examples of businesses that have acted in advance of tough environmental legislation to improve their product design or production process in ways that's enhanced efficiency, reduced waste and boosted their profitability. So our first example, Hitachi. So acting in advance of tough environmental legislation, they made their products easier to recycle and disassemble. And this led them to cut the number of parts used in their washing machines and vacuum cleaners, reducing assembly times, lowering costs and boosting profitability. 3M, again acting in advance of tough environmental legislation, they worked hard to reduce solvent emissions, and this in turn led them to discover a means of doing away with solvents altogether, replacing them with safer and cheaper water-based solutions. So this boosted their profitability whilst being good for the environment at the same time. Another great example, so acting in advance of tough legislation within many of their major markets, forced McDonald's to change the materials they use to wrap their foods. And this was then found not just to reduce waste, but also boost profitability. And those materials have now been adopted by them across the board. And our final example, the American chemical production company DuPont has reportedly made $2 billion savings as a result of being more energy efficient. So it's important that we always learn how to frame environmental improvements in terms of enhancing efficiency and reducing waste. Whilst many of these larger businesses wouldn't normally be associated with environmental improvements, this is an important principle for smaller businesses. It can give them a great opportunity to act in advance of the competition. They're often much more agile and they find it easier to make the necessary changes. In fact, there's the argument that being more agile, smaller companies should lead the way in these areas. I think this is best put by someone called Jan Oostervik. So Jan Oostervik was responsible for launching Ben & Jerry's and the Body Shop in Europe. And this is what he says about this important point. So ethical products from smaller businesses can act like an icebreaker in frozen waters. They show the way for the other companies. So in fact, all businesses, big and small, have a responsibility for working in these areas and really driving social change. And this can also then boost their profitability. There's a great quote on this, actually the final quote for this talk, and it comes from Professor Robert Grant from Georgetown University. And this is what he says about the relationship between driving social change and boosting profitability. So I'm going to change my settings one last time. So, one of the great paradoxes of strategic management is that many companies that have been the most successful at earning profits and creating shareholder value have been companies that shoot such goals in favour of corporate purposes that were oriented towards social change. Conversely, many of the companies that have been most resolutely focused on profitability have suffered dismal financial performance. And of course, part of that social change should be a focus on people. So the final part of the talk, what are the guiding principles in relation to a focus on people? that can also generate more profitability? Well, first of all, in relation to customer strategies. So businesses should attempt to make their products or services available to those people that wouldn't normally be able to afford them or benefit from them. So they're not just for the privileged few, but for everyone. And some of the most successful businesses have pursued this strategy. So for example, Ford made cars affordable for the masses. When they started to pursue this strategy at the start of the 20th century, the financial community heavily criticised them at the time. They said this would cripple the business, but they continued to pursue this strategy and made a car affordable for the masses and generated a huge amount of profitability as a result. Businesses such as Apple and Microsoft have made the computer a tool for every person, not just for specialists or people with extremely high IQs, and everyone has benefited from this. IKEA chose not to focus on the more traditional, wealthy, middle-aged, middle-class homeowners, but on young furniture buyers who want style at low cost, who want to be able to take the furniture away with them the same day. McFit, the German no-frills gym chain that other gyms have copied, likes of Pure Gym, have made gyms affordable for the masses. Nintendo, with the Nintendo Wii games console, chose not to focus just on the 18 to 30-year-old target market, which was the more traditional market, but focus on the family audience who wouldn't normally benefit from game consoles, so families could enjoy playing games together. And this is not just for the larger businesses. Again, small businesses should be pursuing this strategy. This is what we're trying to do with our MBA content. In relation to employee strategies, business should give people who wouldn't normally have the opportunity to work for the business the chance to do so, whilst at the same time enhancing their own organisational capabilities. So some examples of this. So DreamWorks provided training for low-income students in Los Angeles, giving them the skills they need to work in the entertainment industry, whilst at the same time increasing the pool of well-trained graduates that they could select from. Marriott, with their Pathways to Independence program, provided training to welfare recipients, giving them more stable workforce who had excellent customer service. Daimler, the car manufacturer, has formed innovative supply chain partnerships in countries such as Brazil and South Africa, which are not only focused on anti-poverty, but also pro-environment, whilst at the same time giving them high-quality raw materials for their premium cars. And again, this is not just for the big business. Every business should be pursuing these sorts of strategies. In fact, in some ways, small businesses have a responsibility to lead the way in these areas. So we can start to appreciate, perhaps unexpectedly, having a focus on people and planet can drive profitability where we follow certain guiding principles, particularly in relation to planet, where we search out tough environmental legislation globally and try to comply with that legislation and frame environmental improvements in terms of how that can enhance efficiency and reduce waste. In relation to people, so make products and services available to those people who wouldn't normally be able to afford them or benefit from them. And in relation to employees, so give people who wouldn't normally have the opportunity to work for the business the chance to do so, whilst at the same time enhancing their own organisational capabilities. So, and this is, as I mentioned, for every business, big businesses and small businesses, and small business should be leading the way in these areas. So that completes everything I'm going to be covering in this talk. So please let me know if you have any questions. Also, if you'd like any additional information, please contact us through our website, teammba.com.